Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm fortunate to be joined by Nick, one of our advisors here at Sycon Capital. And what I want to talk about is a question that we often see and a question that Nick was talking to me about just this week. So often people come to us and they say, I got a new job, right? And what benefits should I choose? And this is after they've sometimes started a new job. So one of the things we were talking about was Nick had a client who came to him before they accepted a job and they're considering some job offers. So we thought about talking about some of the questions you should be asking before accepting a job offer. Yep. And that's why I'm lucky to have Nick here. So Nick, can you talk to me a little bit about what you're going through in this client situation that we were discussing this week?
Absolutely. And happy to be here, Todd. But no, basically, I have a client. She's a woman, just turned 30. A lot going on right now. Like recently married, her and her husband, have a lot going on as far as potential family planning. She has a really good gig, been there for quite some time at her current role, and got an offer with substantially more income. But with that extra income comes a lot of questions that are going to circle on, what is she leaving behind? What benefits other than a higher income is she going to receive at the new job? But a lot of intangibles that I think a lot of people don't think about, we were able to discuss and kind of come to a conclusion.
So you have a younger family right now, around their early 30s, married but no kids.
No kids.
It seems like they're thinking about having kids at some point, and this woman's been at her job for a period of time. The husband has probably a job that he's been at for a little while, right?
Exactly.
And now she's trying to make a career move and decide what that looks like with all these other things going on. Is that a fair summary of what you're talking about?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think when we look at it, we kind of jump right into this because so many people come to us after, and this is how we would recommend you discuss it beforehand. And what I want to jump into is really 5 questions we think you should ask before accepting a job offer, because these were the exact things I think you were discussing with your clients this week.
Yep,
right?
Correct.
I think the first one is, what does my total compensation actually look like? And when we talk about that, Nick, what are some of the areas that we think about? Because, obviously salary is the first one.
Yeah.
But aside from salary, what else are we really considering when we talk about changing a job and total compensation?
Bonus, commission structure, if that's, the way you're compensated through commissions, any equity from the company as well. If you were previously at let's say a firm for 9 years where you were getting some RSUs and things like that. You're starting fresh at this new job. It's not just the monthly take home that you're looking at. It's everything else as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mention equity, because when we talk about equity, I think that's something that has a very broad term, because when you're working for a large public company, I don't think people think about having ownership in their company, right?
Yeah,
Which is what we associate equity with. And then there's a different conversation around people who may be working for smaller companies and what that looks like. So in this case, I think your particular client actually was working at a larger company for a while, right?
Exactly.
And now are they looking to go to a smaller company or another large company? Is that their consideration?
Yeah, I think equal sizes. I don't believe the new one's public. So It would be,
So that's a very interesting conversation, because I know when we work at large public companies, and there's actually a couple that we deal with. I know Roblox being one of them. We have a lot of employees that we deal with from there, who's a publicly traded company. And often we see restricted stock units, or RSUs. And typically we see a lot of different vesting schedules with those. It's funny, Nick, you mentioned equity compensation, right? Because I think that's very different when you're looking at a publicly traded company versus when you're looking at working at a private company. And then there's small private companies. Well, I want to talk about that for just a second, because oftentimes we deal with clients who are a lot of larger public companies, and we will see them accumulate restricted stock units, or RSUs, which tend to have vesting schedules over time. One of those companies we deal with actually a lot is Roblox, and another one is actually a lot of Amazon employees. Tech companies are often frequently compensating their employees with a lot of RSUs as part of their compensation package. So one of the things we want to consider when we go to some of these new companies, I know why this may not be a consideration with this client, it's something to consider with other ones, is what does your RSU vesting schedule look like? How are you getting that? And what are the prospects for the stock itself? Because stock that's going up versus going down is something that we have to, think about when we're looking at that.
Yeah.
But when we think about clients who are at, in this case, privately held companies, equity doesn't usually come to mind.
Exactly.
But is that ever part of the conversation when you're talking about clients making this kind of transition? Because in my opinion, it can be.
Exactly. I think, if you're at let's say, smaller private company, maybe there's some profit sharing opportunities at the end of the year for you. Maybe you're looking to transition to a public company where you might be able to get RSUs now, right? So I do think that should be part of the conversation, not just looking at that, monthly number from the salary, but, to say, hey, if I'm at this small company making X, I might make the same, maybe even a little less. But if it's let's call it a younger tech-oriented, growthy company where you're going to get some pretty substantial equity afterward. If you're making a little less a month in cash, but you believe in the company and think that they're going to do well over time, it could be a big consideration to see what kind of RSU and maybe deferred comp that you would receive with that.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting because salary and bonus are two of those negotiable situations. But when you get the 401k, sometimes profit sharing, those are governed by ERISA documents. Those aren't as negotiable, right? So oftentimes you can't move the needle on those. Benefits too. Benefits oftentimes are very fixed in what a company can offer because there's a lot of non-discrimination testing. There's a lot of rules and regulations around those.
Yep.
But sometimes when it comes to equity compensation, right, or equity ownership or a path to equity, whether it's a private company or a larger company, sometimes I find those are negotiable with people. So I think if you're looking to move the needle a little bit, this is one of the areas to look at. I also think, when we look at it, it's, total. This is total compensation. This is what money. But I think this leads us into question number 2 is what benefits am I gaining and what benefits am I losing? Exactly. Because now we're getting into some of those intangibles. So with this client, what's been some of that conversation around those benefits that are not necessarily directly linked to finances?
Yeah, no, I think it's something that I don't think too many people think about what they're losing specifically. Let's say for her example, been at the company for 9 years, developed some incredible relationships, right? Not only with her coworkers, but her manager's manager, everybody up the flagpole. When you make a jump and, potentially a little bit more money, you're starting from zero, right? You walk into a new firm, who are people that you're going to be friends with. Who do you trust right away, right? That whole intangible time period, it takes time to navigate your way through a new firm, new company, and things of that nature.
I also think that may lead to the fact that it could be a strong quality of life thing, because if you're at a current firm and you're comfortable and you like the people you're working with and you've earned a lot of credibility to have ability, so to speak, and you've earned trust and respect from those people, moving over to a new firm, does that open up the door of, okay, if there are layoffs at some point, because that's been all over the news, right? A lot of job cuts, a lot of downward revisions of employment. We're hearing more and more that it's difficult to get jobs, and this is not necessarily a job seeker's market right now. Do you have, either has to be concerns about where you sit within that organization, or if there are cuts, right? Where do you, where do you lay within that? Or, the other benefits we talk about is return to office. That's another very controversial situation where if you've been in a company for 9-10 years, do you have more flexibility about being in the office or working remotely, or at least you understand that culture? Have those been part of the conversation?
Absolutely. And I think, there's still a lot of groups out there, especially where, we're located, it's still 3 days a week, right? And, if you're able to be remote that Monday and Friday, especially for somebody like me, right, in early 30s, and a lot of my friends, when you're 20 years old, and in your 20s, I think you're just really looking for that bigger paycheck, right? Like, things are a little bit different, but once you turn 30, for me specifically, or other folks who, you're looking to get married, start a family, and, let's say, you are in your early 30s, those extra 2 days a week when you could be remote, that really helps out, right? For potential childcare, what's that cost, right? If you have pets, are you going to have to leave them at a daycare with a family member, things of that nature, right? Where if you're going to in the office 5 days a week to make a little bit more money, what is that trade-off, right? That opportunity cost, if you would.
That's a very interesting point. I haven't had to think about that in quite a while.
Exactly.
But yeah, wait, what do you do if you have to go in 5 days a week? That's extra daycare that you have to spend, and daycare is not cheap. I've heard some numbers were running between $25,000 and $40,000 a year for certain daycare programs for children. that could be an enormous commitment from families to have to think about. I also think that plays into, for example, like the paid time off policy that certain companies may have, whereas you have companies who may have unlimited paid time off policies, where others have a little bit more of a strict guideline.
15 days a year if you go to a new job and start there, 15 to 20 things like that, where you're used to, hey, my manager trusts me, I get my job done, and on Fridays I can leave at 3, and I might be able to tack on a little extra day of PTO that isn't accounted for. Things like that are intangible, like you said.
I think one of the challenges is because you're talking about someone starting a family, and you're talking about the woman of the family who's looking to do this too, is also maternity leave.
Yes.
Right. Which is a big thing. And I've seen anywhere from companies who offer minimums of like 6 to 8 weeks to companies that offer, 4 months of or more. I've seen some people who could take up to a year off in certain cases for this kind of situation.
And when that time starts too, right? If you start at a new job, do you have to be there for 6 to 12 months before you can even talk about maternity leave as well?
Well, but there's a careful part to navigate, and here's what I think the advice we usually give people around that is when you're asking for that, right? I don't think you want to go in and say, okay, what's the paid time off policy, right? It's very difficult to lead with some of those questions, right? What does it look like for maternity leave? There's protected questions within these interviews, but what I think the best thing to do when you're requesting something is, because it's not just about asking certain questions, it's about making sure that the employer and the person interviewing may not know the whole benefits guide, is asking for that benefits guide, asking for the layout of what all those policies look like, just so you can review them. And I think that's the best way that you go about this. I probably wouldn't do it in the first interview, but when you move to the later parts of where you start to consider compensation, where you start to have those conversations, asking for those benefits package allows you to objectively review what all your different options are in those areas.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's the benefits are one too, where specifically, you ask people if they've reviewed them or understand the benefits yet, if they just chose a new job. And I think benefits is the first thing that people say, no, I actually haven't taken a look at it yet. That's just seems to be on the back burner when you're just focused on, you have a lot of moving pieces when it comes to a potential move. And that one gets put on the back burner. But as we kind of just ran through, it's one that's rather important.
Yeah, exactly. So many people don't ask for the benefits guide until like after the fact. And it's like the time to ask for it is before, when you're making that decision, especially if you're weighing leaving a job or having multiple job offers. I think that's the great way to go about it, because the bottom line is not all compensation shows up in the paycheck. And this leads us to question number 3, though, which I think is a really important one. So we have question number 1, what does my total compensation look like? Number 2 is, what benefits am I gaining and what am I losing? And question number 3 is really, what am I leaving behind?
Yeah.
And we talked about some of those intangibles with the benefit, right? How those change over time. But I think there's actually financial implications of that. And we alluded to these in the earlier conversations. But when you've been in a company for a while, you may have accrued things. You may have accrued like paid time off that needs to be paid out to you. You may have had stock grants or RSUs. You may already be vested in your 401k. And I think particularly like with RSUs, there's a bit of a snowball effect, because a lot of them, they may have a cliff vesting of 3 years. Some of them have a gradual vesting where they'll vest, incrementally over 3 years. But when you've been in a company for, let's call it 5-6 years, you have various grants. And now every year you may have, multiple grants vesting at the same time.
Yep.
So those are real big. Also PTO, sometimes as you've been in a company for a longer period of time, you have more days that you become eligible for.
Exactly. And, and I think it's big in the financial services industry, as we've seen, maybe not for advisors like us, but if you're in something like investment banking or research or, wholesaling, where a majority of your income is tied to a bonus that you're going to receive in, let's say, March, like what's the timing? Are you going to miss out on potentially half of your income because of the timing that you moved as well? That's, timing is going to be key here as well.
Well, so that's a very interesting point, because I think when you start to talk about moves, especially when you talk about like in financial services, or you may talk about account or sales executives where relationships are a very important part. Sometimes there's contracts involved.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's clawbacks in those contracts. Sometimes there's non-solicitation agreements. Not all those things people are in a position to evaluate themselves.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes you go to a company like, oh, let us see your contract, and they'll read it over and they're like, okay, you'll be fine. One of the pieces of advice we often give people who do have employment agreements, especially with non-solicits or anything like that, is go to a lawyer. And maybe the best hour or 2 hours that you've ever spent having that conversation, be like, hey, listen, if I go leave and go to this company, what are the implications, right? Can you tell me what I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do or anything of that nature based on my agreement with my previous employer?
Exactly.
Because that's the person who's going to have your best interest in mind. The incoming company may not do that. And what we've seen is sometimes they may hire an attorney to give you advice, but you got to remember, if they're paying the attorney's representing them,
Exactly.
not necessarily representing you.
Your best interests.
And that's a really important part of understanding what you're leaving behind, because those employment agreements detail a lot of different information. And I know in the financial services world, we've seen a lot of like lawsuits.
Absolutely.
And we've seen a lot of litigation around that recently, and what's determined regular compensation versus what's ERISA versus everything like that. So I always see you get those employment agreements taken a look at, and what those non-competes and non-solicits look like before you make those moves.
Exactly.
And definitively before you ever share any information with a new company while you're employed there. Has that been part of the conversations that you're having? What's come up there?
Yeah, I think in her instance, no sort of non-compete, but there have been others as well, right? Where and like you said, it's been a tough job market, right? And some people leave companies, they don't need to want to hire anyone else, and I know retention bonuses have been big as well, and that's something where, hey, you might spend the best hour, 2 hours on an attorney to review that to make sure, okay, well, I was paid X to stay here for a certain period of time, right? If I break this contract, how much am I going to owe, right? If it was, let's just say $50,000 to stay, did you actually receive $50,000? How much was taken out in taxes? How much do you owe back, right? Even if you put it in an investment account, the initial dollar amount that you received, just in case you left early, is there enough there to pay back, right? Probably not if taxes and were taken out. So there's just a lot of, like we've talked about, there's a lot of, tangible items, intangible that, not too many people, not that they don't think about, but could be left on the back burner when you're just looking at a potential salary increase. So.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think if you're getting contracts, reviewed when you're leaving, and this isn't every job, right? Really, this becomes these relationship sales, outside facing jobs where I think these are the biggest influence is, have those contracts are looked at a new job, because sometimes what we see is if you're more restricted in a new a new job or something like that, that could lead to, some that may affect your long-term look. And we talked about all the different resources people have, right, and what they should consider. But what we need to talk about is like, how does this fit into this family's long-term plan, right? How does this align with their values? Because ultimately, I find it very difficult to make financial decisions unless we can do that.
Yeah.
So how did you help talk to them about how this comes together with their values? How did you help them identify what values were important to them today, and maybe even down the road as they're trying to start a family, and who may take care of a kid or how much they want to be around? What did that conversation look like?
Exactly. And, that's, as financial planners, I think we see it all too often where we're in an instance where we can't tell you what your goals are, right? But we can help you get there. And in order to do that, we talked about, we use a program here at Sycon called Asset Map. We take a look at a one-page snapshot balance sheet of everything the family owns, and we're able to, do some cash flow analysis around that, because basically the question isn't, is this the right job? Is this a good job? Is this the right job for me? And, if you have certain values where, hey, we want at least one parent home at all times with the new child, right? We want to be able to go to soccer and lacrosse practice. And if you're taking a new job with a bigger paycheck, are you going to be able to do all these things? And we can see, hey, with your current income and with the current plan we have in place, actually, if this is what you want, we're already on track to get there. So do you need to take that additional paycheck and more time in the office in order to get to your goals? I think some people just see more money and kind of forget, what they're really working towards.
Yeah, certainly. And it's interesting because you're talking about a family here who doesn't have children, who's kind of emerging anyway. And I know we keep coming back to this concept of kids, but I find you and I are at this age where they become a bigger and bigger part of the equation. And
Yep.
it starts out with, okay, I'm having children. I have someone, how do I pay for daycare? And then you think, okay, well, it'll be a few years until my kids are in school. And I'm in that situation where all my kids are now in school.
Yep.
But I got to tell you, I actually feel like sometimes it is more demands, because now it's okay. They are, I'm the class parent. So I'm in there for the parties.
Field trips.
I have to do the pickups, or we're running late for a day because the kid's not feeling sick or doesn't want to go to school or needs picked up early. And does one parent have that flexibility to be around, or have that job that has that flexibility to be around for their children? And I think that's an important part of it. And then, as you alluded to before, being there for sports or leaving early. It's some of these practices started like 3:30, 3:45 in the afternoon, which is well before a lot of
And
people
if
get
you're
done with
coaching,
their
you got to
job.
put in some time too, for to figure everything out as well.
I think the interesting thing, though, that I like to get across to people who are watching is it's great to know this, but how the heck do you know if the job itself actually offers that kind of flexibility?
I think.
And I think one of the things is because this is that work-life balance. So maybe, but if you go into an interview and I think it's like, okay, well, what's my work-life balance look like? There's like a stigma attached to that sometimes.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, do you get any feedback from your friends who are looking for jobs and stuff like now? Have they given you any stories around any of that?
As far as it's like, like we said previously, that's almost like one of those unwritten rules. That's not what you bring up in the first interview, right? It's kind of a interesting one. I feel like you have to dive in head first and figure it out.
Here's where I'll come in on that, right?
Okay.
Because one of the things I'll give you is, I think an interesting question is always to ask the person who is interviewing you. Number one, why did the previous person leave, right? Why is there a vacancy, and understand that, right? And see how they answer that, and talk to that, right? And you're looking like, oh, the person, was away too much or off with their family, right?
Exactly.
That's something to consider. But you could also ask the person that's interviewing yourself, tell me a little bit about your day. Tell me a little bit about the the things that you're doing, because you're trying to get an understanding about what that culture of the company is.
Yep.
And if you find that there's a lot of people there that are spending time with family, friends, understanding that they have that flexibility, I think that could give you some insight into what these kinds of things look like. Not trying to turn this into like, recruiter video.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
But I think that what we see is that I don't want clients coming to us in 3 months saying, I wish I had stayed at that other job, or I have to quit because I want that flexibility. And now we're solving a whole nother problem as financial advisors, right? Now we're trying to say, okay, how do you maintain like a lifestyle, or how do you spread your financial resources, or how are we now draining financial resources and setting back years of savings
And what
because of things that we could have explored up front?
Yeah. And what do future employers think? If you are able to even find a job and, move immediately, how long is it going to take? What did you left a place for 9 years to go somewhere for a few months to find another spot? It's, those are all things that, hopefully we can consider and work through prior to making the wrong decision. Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so I think that is about communication too. I think that brings me to question number 5 is, have I talked to the people I trust before making the decision? And the key here is before.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So, when you think about it, right, obviously right now you're talking to a couple. So they're obviously spouses and talking to each other. Have you seen them asking family for advice, or any other people? Like, have they shared with you how that conversation is going?
Yeah, I think it's one thing too. Like it's, you have family and friends, people that you trust to talk to, but then also it's important to, I think, if you have the ability, bring in the professionals, right, who see it every day and don't have any biased opinions toward you and, time and everything. But I think the worst thing you could do is make a rushed, rash decision on your own, right? That's probably, if there's one thing not to do, that's the one, right? Diving into something that you shouldn't, wasting time and money, and not understanding the full picture as well. Kind of like we've been walking through, right? Making sure steady, understanding everything, and bringing in people here at the end, not only family and friends but also professionals, is much better than diving into something immediately.
Yeah, and in your case, obviously, they're bringing in the financial advisor to this, right?
Yep.
And if you need an attorney. Now, I want to stress this a little bit because I think it's really important. A ChatGPT is probably not a trusted advisor in this particular situation.
There's a disclosure there.
So just something to think about that, AI, can only go so far.
Yep.
But we urge you to really talk about the people who know you and understand the job and those professionals, because we were alluding to this before as well, that we can give some insight into someone who comes in and say, hey, I'm looking at taking a job at this company or that company. We may know people. We're seeing the inner workings of a lot of finances for people who are at a lot of different companies. We're not going to talk about other clients, but we can talk about what we know about these firms, what we know about their benefits.
Exactly.
I mean, we deal with so many Roblox employees. We actually have like a benefits guide that we put together around their stuff. So there is a lot of insight that we can give you. So I think that's the whole premise of this, is have those conversations beforehand. And I think that's really, really important. And remember that it's very difficult to do this, and why I think you bring the trusted advisor in, because the decision you may make in your 20s versus what you might make in your 30s may be very different than what you're making in your 40s and 50s.
Absolutely. As values change, these decisions begin to change, right? So.
Nick, I think this has been a really great conversation. I think that there's a lot to unpack here, and we could probably dig a lot deeper on a lot of these topics in depth. But I think when you're considering making a change across different decades, talk to the people beforehand. If you ever have questions about benefits for anything, especially our own clients, please reach out to us.